The first thing I heard that morning was my mother crying. Not because she was sorry. Because the judge had just told the opposing attorney to read page 4. She's unstable, their lawyer had argued only seconds earlier, standing tall in his expensive charcoal suit like he already owned the courtroom. Combat trauma has severely impacted Commander Carter's emotional judgment. I sat quietly at the defense table in the Norfolk courthouse, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I didn't react. That seemed to bother him more than anything else. She has a documented history of detachment insomnia, emotional withdrawal. The judge raised a hand. The room fell silent. Judge Harold Whitmore was somewhere in his late 60s, broad-shouldered despite his age, with silver hair combed straight back and deep lines around his eyes. That told me he'd seen more hardship than most men admitted. I later learned he'd served as a military prosecutor decades earlier, but in that moment he simply looked tired. Tired of lies. He stared at the attorney for several long seconds. Then he spoke softly. "Counselor?" The attorney stopped mid-sentence. "Read page 4. The man blinked once, confused. Then he lowered his eyes to the military evaluation file in front of him. I watched the color slowly drain from his face. Across the courtroom, my father straightened in his seat. My mother grabbed his arm. And for the first time all morning, nobody looked at me like I was broken. That was the moment everything finally began to change. But to understand how I ended up in that courtroom at 42 years old being called unstable by my own family, you have to go back much further. Back before the Navy. Back before the wars. Back before I learned how easy it was for people to praise sacrifice from a distance while resenting it up close. I grew up in a small town outside Macon, Georgia, where summers smelled like cut grass and diesel fuel, and everybody knew your business before supper. My father owned a modest auto repair garage just off Route 80. My mother worked part-time at the church office and spent most of her energy pretending our family was happier than it really was. My younger brother Daniel was the center of everything. Football star, loud laugh, easy smile. People loved boys like Daniel in towns like ours. Me, I was quieter, taller than most girls my age, more comfortable holding a wrench than gossiping at beauty salons. My mother used to say I walked like I was headed somewhere angry. The only person who ever seemed to understand me was my grandfather Walter. He'd fought in Korea when he was barely older than I was, never spoke much about it. But every morning at dawn he drank black coffee on his porch while listening to the local radio station give farm reports and old country songs. When I was 12 he taught me how to rebuild a carburetor. Machines tell the truth, he said. People usually don't. I never forgot that. Grandpa Walter lived in a weathered white farmhouse about 20 minutes outside town. Most weekends I escaped there while my parents followed Daniel from one football game to another. Together we repaired old tractors, fixed fence posts, and listened to Braves games on the radio. He treated me like I mattered. That alone probably saved my life. By the time I turned 17, America had changed. Everybody remembers where they were when they saw the towers fall. I was in high school chemistry class. Mrs. Donnelly wheeled in an old television set, and 30 teenagers watched smoke pour into the New York sky while nobody in the room spoke. Something shifted inside me that day. Not anger exactly. Responsibility. Within months, military recruiters started appearing everywhere. Some boys talked tough about joining until graduation actually arrived. Most never did. I did. The night I told my parents I'd enlisted in the Navy, my mother looked at me like I'd announced a prison sentence. "Oh, Evelyn," she sighed, setting down her fork. "Why would you throw your life away like that?" "It's not throwing my life away." My father barely looked up from his dinner plate. "You'll quit in 6 months," he muttered. "Military ain't built for women." Daniel laughed. "You gonna shave your head, too?" I remember sitting there at that old kitchen table staring at the steam rising off mashed potatoes while realizing nobody in my own family believed I could do it. Nobody except Grandpa Walter. When I visited him the next afternoon, he listened quietly while rocking back and forth on his porch swing. Finally, he nodded once. "You scared?" "Yes, sir." "Good," he said. "Means you understand what service costs." The morning I left for boot camp, nobody came to the station except him. No mother crying. No proud father handshake. Just Grandpa Walter standing beside a rusted Ford pickup beneath gray Georgia clouds. Before I boarded the bus, he pressed something cold into my palm. His old dog tags. The metal was scratched and worn smooth with age. "You carry these," he said, "and remember something." I swallowed hard. "You don't serve because people clap for you. You serve because somebody has to." I hugged him then tighter than I meant to. As the bus pulled away, I looked back through the window and saw him standing alone with his hand raised in salute. That image stayed with me through every deployment, every funeral, every nightmare, and every lonely hotel room over the next 20 years. At the time, though, I was just a scared Georgia girl headed toward a future nobody around her believed she could survive. I had no idea that one day the same family who doubted me would sit across a courtroom trying to use my service against me, or that page 4 would finally expose all of them. Boot camp in Great Lakes hit me like a freight train in January. The wind off Lake Michigan cut straight through the cheap civilian jacket I arrived in, and within the first hour I understood something important about military life. Nobody cared where you came from once those doors closed behind you. Not your hometown, not your feelings, not whether your family believed in you. The Navy stripped all of that away fast. By the end of the first week, my voice was gone from shouting cadence, my feet bled through my socks, and I'd been screamed at by men who seemed personally offended by my existence. Especially because I was a woman. That part surprised me less than it probably should have. One chief petty officer from Alabama looked me dead in the eye during training exercises and said, "Women don't belong on ships. They belong writing letters to the men on ships." I remember standing there exhausted, rain soaking through my uniform, wanting badly to prove him wrong, but understanding something even more important. Talking wouldn't do it. Only surviving would. So I stopped trying to impress people. I just worked. I ran harder, studied longer, learned faster. And little by little, the people around me started changing the way they looked at me. Not all at once, but enough. The Navy has a strange way of turning strangers into family, not through speeches or patriotism, but through shared misery. You learn who somebody is at 3 a.m, cleaning flooded compartments, or standing watch half frozen while waves slam against steel. That's where trust begins. My first deployment came 2 years later aboard the USS Farragut, a destroyer operating in the Persian Gulf. I was 21 years old, and still carrying Grandpa Walter's dog tags tucked inside my locker. The ship smelled like machine oil, coffee, salt, air, and exhaustion. I loved it immediately. Life at sea settles into your bones after a while. Days blur together under fluorescent lights. You stop noticing time. Some nights the ocean looked black as motor oil beneath the moon. Other nights the water glowed silver all the way to the horizon. There were moments of beauty out there most civilians never get to see, and moments of fear they should never have to. By then, America had been at war for years. Every deployment carried tension. You learned to sleep lightly, learned to recognize the sound of alarms instantly, learned that bravery usually looked less like heroics and more like doing your job while terrified. I became close friends with a corpsman named Luis Ortega from San Antonio. Funny kid, could make an entire mess hall laugh after 20-hour shifts. He used to keep photographs of his mother tucked into his helmet liner. "Woman still thinks I'm too skinny," he'd joke. Then there was Chief Ramsey, a grizzled engineer from Kentucky who chewed tobacco constantly and treated younger sailors like rough-edged sons and daughters whether he admitted it or not. And Melanie Brooks from Ohio, another officer who taught me how to survive in rooms full of men determined to underestimate you. "You don't need their approval," she told me one night during watch. "You need their respect. Different thing entirely." I carried that lesson for the rest of my career. Letters from home became less frequent over time. Grandpa Walter wrote every month in shaky handwriting, usually short notes about weather, baseball scores, or repairs he was making around the farm. My parents rarely wrote at all. Daniel sent exactly one email in 3 years asking if I could loan him money after some business idea collapsed. I wired him $2,000 anyway. Funny thing about family, sometimes you spend your whole life trying to earn love that should have been given freely to begin with. Still, overseas service changes your perspective. You stop keeping score after a while. Then came the convoy attack. Even now, all these years later, certain sounds still return clearer than faces. The crack of gunfire against metal. Radio chatter overlapping too fast to understand. Somebody screaming for a medic. We were supporting evacuation operations outside Basra when the roadside explosion hit the second vehicle in our convoy. Everything afterward happened in pieces. Smoke, fire, sand whipping through the air. I remember seeing one Humvee overturned and another burning from the inside. Ammunition was cooking off in sharp, popping bursts while wounded personnel tried crawling away from the wreckage. Training takes over in moments like that. You don't think, you move. I pulled one sailor clear whose uniform was already on fire. Another had shrapnel embedded deep in his leg. Luis was beside me applying pressure to wounds while bullets snapped overhead somewhere in the distance. Then somebody yelled there were still people trapped inside the vehicle. I remember Ramsey grabbing my shoulder. "Commander, don't." But I was already moving. The heat inside that wreck felt like opening a furnace door. Smoke blinded me almost immediately. I found one sailor unconscious near the rear compartment and dragged him out by his vest. Then I went back in again. And again. The third time part of the vehicle collapsed. That's when I found Luis. He was still conscious barely. Blood soaked through his gear so heavily my hand slipped trying to hold pressure on the wound. He looked at me and whispered, "Tell my mom I wasn't scared." I told him I would. He died before the helicopter arrived. For years afterward, I blamed myself for not getting to him sooner. That's the part civilians misunderstand about combat trauma. It's not weakness. It's memory that refuses to loosen its grip. Back home, newspapers called us heroes. People at airports clapped. Politicians gave speeches. But what stayed with me weren't medals or headlines. It was Luis asking for his mother. It was writing condolence letters at midnight while trying not to cry onto official Navy stationery. It was standing beside folded flags, knowing no sentence on earth could return someone's child. The Navy awarded me commendations after that operation. Promotions followed. Responsibility followed faster. But something inside me hardened too. Not cold exactly. Just quieter. When I finally returned to Georgia during leave almost a year later, my father barely asked about the deployment. Instead, he leaned against the garage doorway and said, "So what's the long-term plan here?" I frowned. "What do you mean? You gonna do this forever?" "This is my career." He wiped grease off his hands onto a rag. "Ain't much of a life." I remember glancing around the garage at rusted pickup trucks and old tools hanging from pegboards, while realizing we no longer understood each other at all. That night I drove out to Grandpa Walter's farmhouse instead. He was older by then, walking slower, but when he saw me in uniform his eyes filled with quiet pride. Inside the living room he'd hung my Navy photograph beside his own faded military portrait from Korea, side by side. For the first time in my life I felt like somebody saw me clearly. Not as damaged, not as difficult, not as less than, just worthy. I didn't know then how important that feeling would become years later when the people sitting in that courtroom tried convincing the world I was unstable, because the truth was the Navy hadn't destroyed me. It had revealed who I already was. By the time I turned 38, I had spent more of my life in uniform than out of it. The Navy had taken me across oceans through war zones, hurricane disasters, refugee evacuations, and military hospitals where silence carried heavier weight than conversation. I'd stood on flight decks during sunrise over the Arabian Sea, and inside temporary morgues where young men came home under flags instead of their own power. People imagine military service as one long parade of action and patriotism. Most of it is endurance. Endurance of loneliness. Endurance of responsibility. Endurance of carrying memories nobody around you really wants to hear. I stayed in because I believed the work mattered. Maybe that sounds old-fashioned now, but a lot of us from that generation still believed service to country meant something sacred, especially after losing people beside you. I made commander 2 years before retirement. Grandpa Walter cried when I told him. Actually cried. I'd only seen that man tear up once before at Grandma Ruth's funeral back in 1998. "You did good, Evie," he whispered over the phone. "Real good." Nobody else in the family seemed particularly impressed. Daniel had gone through 3 failed business ventures by then. Landscaping company, boat dealership, some online sports memorabilia operation that collapsed almost immediately. My parents always blamed bad luck or dishonest partners. Funny how accountability worked differently for him. When I visited Georgia during leave, my mother still asked questions like, "Don't you ever get lonely? Wouldn't you rather settle down? Don't you think it's time to stop living like a soldier?" As though service were some embarrassing phase I'd failed to outgrow. The truth was, by then I didn't know how to explain my life to civilians anymore, not completely. How do you describe the feeling of watching helicopters lift survivors from flooded rooftops after Hurricane Katrina? Or sitting beside a 19-year-old Marine having a panic attack because fireworks reminded him of mortar fire, or calling parents at 2 a.m. because military protocol requires someone tell them their son isn't coming home. Some experiences separate you quietly from other people. Not better, not worse, just different. I retired from active service the same year Grandpa Walter's health began failing. Congestive heart failure, arthritis, memory problems creeping in slowly around the edges. I moved to Norfolk afterward, partly because of the Navy community there and partly because I couldn't stand the thought of settling back permanently in Georgia. Still, I visited Grandpa every chance I got. Those visits became smaller over time, softer. He tired easily, forgot names occasionally, sometimes repeated stories from Korea 3 times in one afternoon. But whenever I walked through the door, his face still lit up the same way. One evening we sat together on his porch watching rain move across distant fields. "You ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "The Navy." He nodded. I thought about all the funerals, all the scars, all the empty apartments after deployments ended. Then I shook my head. "No, sir." He smiled faintly. "Good." That was the last real conversation we ever had. 3 months later, Daniel called me during a veterans housing fundraiser in Norfolk. "Grandpa took a fall," he said quickly. "Doctors say his memory's getting worse." I drove through the night to Georgia. When I arrived at the hospital, my mother looked exhausted but strangely guarded. My father barely spoke. Daniel kept acting overly helpful in a way that immediately made me suspicious. Grandpa seemed confused that day, frail, smaller somehow. But when everybody else stepped outside the room, he squeezed my wrist tightly and whispered, "Don't let them shame you for serving." I frowned. "What do you mean?" His eyes shifted nervously toward the hallway. Before he could answer, Daniel walked back in smiling. "You know how Grandpa gets," he said lightly. Something inside me tightened. Over the next several weeks, little things stopped making sense. Bank paperwork appeared suddenly. Property discussions happened without me included. Daniel started mentioning long-term care decisions constantly. My mother worried aloud about whether stress from my military experiences made family conflict too difficult for me emotionally. At first, I ignored it. Then one afternoon I found paperwork on the kitchen counter referencing psychiatric evaluations from the VA. Mine. My stomach dropped. "What is this?" Daniel took the folder calmly. "Relax, we're just making sure Grandpa's affairs stay protected." "Protected from who?" His jaw tightened. "Evie, you've been through a lot." I stared at him in disbelief. "You're using my military records. Nobody's attacking you." But that's exactly what they were doing. Over the following months I learned pieces slowly. Daniel had convinced my parents that my combat history made me emotionally unstable. He exaggerated routine VA counseling appointments into signs of dangerous psychological decline. Ordinary insomnia became episodes. Quietness became withdrawal. Grief became instability. Worst of all, they'd apparently been feeding these concerns into Grandpa's ear during periods when his memory was weakest. I still remember standing in my childhood kitchen while my mother said softly, "We just worry you're carrying too much trauma to handle complicated decisions." Trauma. That word again. People love veterans until the moment our scars make them uncomfortable. I looked at my father. "You really believe that?" He avoided my eyes. And somehow that hurt worse than if he'd yelled. Grandpa Walter died 6 weeks later. Heart failure. I made it to the hospital 20 minutes after he passed. Daniel was already discussing estate matters before the funeral even happened. I barely listened. All I could think about was Grandpa saluting me at 17 years old while everybody else doubted me. At the funeral, old veterans from town attended wearing faded caps from Korea and Vietnam. Several approached me afterward to shake my hand. My family noticed. They also noticed something else. Grandpa had left behind more than farmland. Years earlier, he'd quietly invested in coastal property near Savannah that became extremely valuable over time. There were also military pension investments, and most importantly, plans for a Veterans Outreach Foundation he'd been funding privately for years. That's when everything turned ugly. Within months, whispers started around town. Poor Evelyn came home damaged. Heard she's got PTSD pretty bad. She's not herself anymore. I recognized exactly where those rumors came from. And despite everything, I still didn't fight back publicly. Instead, I buried myself helping veterans around Norfolk. Housing assistance, counseling referrals, hospital visits, quiet work nobody televised. That's where I met Earl Jackson, Vietnam veteran, 71 years old, deep gravel voice, walked with a cane, and saw through people almost immediately. One afternoon after a support meeting, he sat beside me outside the VA building and asked, "You always this calm when folks stab you in the back?" I gave a tired laugh. Trying to be, he studied me carefully. "Sometimes strangers salute you faster than blood ever will." I never forgot that either. 2 weeks later, certified court papers arrived at my apartment. My own family was petitioning the court to declare me psychologically incompetent to oversee Grandpa's estate and Veterans Foundation. The basis: combat-related emotional instability. I sat alone at my kitchen table staring at those documents until sunrise. After 20 years serving my country, after every deployment, every sacrifice, every funeral folded into memory, the people accusing me of being unstable were the very people I'd spent my life trying to make proud. And somehow that betrayal hurt more than war ever did. The morning of the hearing, Norfolk was wrapped in cold gray rain. I remember standing outside the courthouse holding a paper cup of coffee I never drank, watching water slide down the stone steps, while reporters gathered near the entrance. Somebody from a local station recognized my name from an old military article online. "Commander Carter," a young woman called carefully. "Would you like to comment on the family competency dispute?" Competency dispute? Funny how clean words can make ugly things sound respectable. I shook my head and kept walking. Inside, the courthouse smelled like old paper-polished wood and burnt coffee from vending machines that probably hadn't changed since the Reagan administration. Elderly couples sat waiting for probate hearings. Bailiffs moved calmly through metal detectors. Somewhere down the hallway, somebody was crying softly behind a closed door. American courthouses always feel strangely human to me, lives changing quietly under fluorescent lights. Earl was waiting near courtroom 3. He wore his Vietnam veteran cap and an old brown overcoat despite the heat inside the building. "You sleep at all?" he asked. "Not much." "That's all right," he muttered. "Truth don't usually sleep much either." I smiled faintly. Then I saw my family. My mother sat rigidly beside Daniel at the far end of the hallway, clutching her purse tightly in both hands. My father stood near the courtroom door, staring at the floor like he wished he were somewhere else entirely. Nobody greeted me. That hurt less than I expected. By then, something inside me had gone strangely still. The hearing began at 9 sharp. Judge Whitmore entered quietly, carrying a thick stack of files beneath one arm. Everybody rose. I studied him carefully as we sat back down. He wasn't dramatic. Didn't bark orders. Didn't seem interested in theatrics. But there was something steady about him that reminded me of older military officers I'd trusted over the years. Men who listened before speaking. The attorney representing my family introduced himself first. Richard Holloway. Expensive watch. Perfect hair. The kind of polished confidence money buys over time. He smiled at the judge like they were old colleagues. Then he began dismantling my life. "Your Honor, this is a deeply unfortunate matter involving a decorated veteran suffering from severe combat-related psychological impairment." I stared straight ahead. "Commander Carter has demonstrated prolonged emotional withdrawal, social isolation, insomnia, and compromised interpersonal stability following multiple wartime deployments." Every sentence sounded rehearsed. Clinical, designed to turn sacrifice into weakness. He referenced VA counseling records, sleep medications, therapy appointments after deployment trauma. At one point, he actually used the phrase "individuals with unresolved combat stress often struggle distinguishing emotional attachment from rational financial judgment." I heard my mother sniffle quietly beside Daniel. Still, I said nothing. That seemed to frustrate him. "Your Honor," Holloway continued, "the Carter family simply wishes to ensure the late Walter Carter's estate and charitable foundation remain under emotionally stable management." Emotionally stable. I almost laughed. This from the family who spent years lying to an old man while his memory faded. Judge Whitmore leaned back slightly. "Has Commander Carter exhibited violence?" "No, Your Honor." "Financial recklessness?" "Number." "Substance abuse?" "Number." The attorney adjusted his tie. "However, trauma manifests differently in different individuals." There it was again. Trauma, like a stain they could point toward whenever convenient. Holloway approached the bench with a stack of documents. "She's unstable," he said firmly. "Combat trauma has significantly impaired her judgment." I heard somebody shift in the gallery behind me, but I remained perfectly still. Then he made his mistake. "Frankly, Your Honor, decorated veterans sometimes develop distorted self-perceptions regarding their service records. Emotional exaggeration is not uncommon among individuals coping with post-combat identity trauma." The courtroom went silent. Even Daniel looked uncomfortable hearing that. Judge Whitmore slowly removed his glasses. For several seconds, he simply stared at the attorney. Not angry. Not shocked. Just deeply disappointed. Then he spoke. "Counselor, Holloway straightened confidently. Yes, Your Honor. The judge tapped a document near the top of the military evaluation file. Read page 4. The attorney frowned slightly. I'm sorry. Page 4. A strange feeling moved through the room. Holloway flipped through the file casually at first. Then slower. Then suddenly not casually at all. I watched the color drain from his face almost instantly. My mother leaned toward Daniel. What is it? She whispered. The attorney swallowed hard. Judge Whitmore's voice remained calm. Read it aloud. Holloway hesitated. Your Honor. Aloud. The attorney cleared his throat shakily. Official testimony submitted by Lieutenant Commander Michael Reeves regarding evacuation operations outside Basra, Iraq. He stopped briefly. The room was so quiet I could hear rain tapping faintly against courthouse windows. Commander Evelyn Carter re-entered an active hostile fire zone on 3 separate occasions, despite direct orders to withdraw. His voice weakened. Successfully extracting 12 injured personnel from a burning transport vehicle while under sustained enemy attack. I closed my eyes briefly. For years I'd tried not to relive that day, but suddenly I could smell smoke again. Hear Luis coughing blood into my shoulder. Holloway continued reading. Medical evaluation following the incident concluded Commander Carter demonstrated exceptional psychological regulation under catastrophic combat conditions. The attorney stopped again. Judge Whitmore looked at him steadily. Continue. Holloway's hands visibly trembled now. Her conduct directly prevented significant additional casualties and reflected, quote, extraordinary emotional discipline and command stability. Across the courtroom, my father's face had gone completely pale. But the judge wasn't finished. There's another paragraph, he said quietly. Holloway stared at the page like he wanted to disappear. Then he read the final section. A supplemental statement from Walter Carter attached to the estate filing. My breath caught. I'd never seen this document before. Holloway swallowed hard. If my granddaughter carried war home inside her, it's because she carried America first. Any pain she bears came from protecting sons and daughters who belonged to all of us. My mother covered her mouth. Daniel looked down at the table. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw shame enter that courtroom. Real shame. Not mine. Theirs. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Then Judge Whitmore folded his hands carefully. Counselor? He said softly. Do you truly wish to continue arguing that decorated military service constitutes evidence of incompetence? Holloway opened his mouth. Closed it again. No, Your Honor. The judge nodded once. Good. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I mostly felt tired. So incredibly tired. Because no courtroom ruling could erase the fact that my own family had tried turning the hardest years of my life into a weapon against me. The hearing recessed shortly afterward. As people slowly stood to leave, reporters rushed into the hallway outside. I remained seated. Earl placed one weathered hand gently on my shoulder. You all right, Commander? I stared at Grandpa Walter's statement lying open across the table. Then I whispered the truth. No, I said quietly. But maybe I finally stopped being ashamed of surviving. The story should have ended after page 4. That's what most people think about courtroom battles. One dramatic revelation, one emotional speech, one side exposed, the other vindicated. Real life doesn't work that way. You can win a case and still lose sleep. You can prove people wrong and still feel hollow afterward. The hearing made local news by evening. Not national headlines or anything dramatic like that. Just one of those regional human interest stories older Americans still watch during dinner. A decorated Navy commander accused of instability by her own family. A judge publicly criticizing the misuse of PTSD stereotypes against veterans. By sunrise the next morning, my voicemail was full. Former sailors, retired officers, widows of men I'd served beside, even strangers. One message came from the mother of a Marine I'd helped evacuate years earlier during a flood response operation in Louisiana. You don't know me personally, she said softly through static, but my son came home because of people like you. Don't let anybody make you ashamed of surviving. I sat in my kitchen listening to that message 3 separate times. Then I turned the phone off. I needed silence more than validation. Outside my apartment, Norfolk carried on like normal. Delivery trucks rolled through damp streets. Retired Navy men drank coffee at corner diners discussing weather and politics. Tugboats moved slowly through the harbor while gray gulls circled overhead. Ordinary life. That's the strange thing about personal devastation. The world keeps moving while you stand still inside it. Around noon there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, 2 men stood there wearing old navy dress coats, despite the chilly wind outside. For half a second, I didn't recognize them. Then one smiled. "Commander Carter," he said warmly. It was Chief Ramsey. Older now, more gray hair, moving slower. Beside him stood Tyler Brooks, the young sailor I'd dragged from the burning vehicle outside Basra all those years ago. He walked with a slight limp from permanent nerve damage in his left leg. I hadn't seen either man in nearly a decade. Before I could speak, Ramsey handed me a paper bag. "Coffee and peach pie," he said. Figured Georgia girls still like peach pie. That nearly broke me right there. We spent most of the afternoon sitting around my tiny kitchen table talking quietly about old deployments, mutual friends, retirement aches, and the strange adjustment of growing older after military life. At one point, Tyler looked at me carefully and said, "You know there are people alive because of you, right?" I stared down into my coffee. "I know people died too." He nodded slowly. "That's not the same thing. But veterans carry ghosts differently than civilians do. Nobody comes home from war entirely untouched. The lucky ones simply learn how to keep walking with the weight." Before leaving, Ramsey paused near the door. "Heard what your family tried pulling," he muttered. "Disgraceful." I shrugged faintly. "They're still my family." Ramsey studied me for a long moment. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes decent people forgive things long before they should." After they left, I sat alone watching darkness settle across the harbor. And for the first time since the hearing, I let myself cry. Not loud, not dramatic. Just years of exhaustion finally leaking out slowly. The next court session wasn't scheduled for another week. Judge Whitmore wanted additional review regarding Grandpa Walter's estate filings and the Veterans Foundation structure. That gave my family time to panic. Daniel called 3 times. I ignored every call. Then my father showed up unexpectedly outside the Veterans Outreach office where I volunteered twice a week. He stood beside his truck, awkwardly, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Seeing him there startled me more than anger would have. He looked older, smaller somehow. The proud certainty he'd carried most of my life seemed worn down around the edges. "Mind talking?" he asked quietly. We walked to a nearby bench overlooking the water. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You embarrassed us pretty bad in court." I almost laughed at the absurdity of that sentence. "You think I embarrassed you?" His jaw tightened. "That ain't what I meant." I stared out across the harbor. "You know what the worst part was?" I asked softly. "Not the lawsuit, not the rumors. It was hearing my own father sit there while strangers called me unstable because of military service." He rubbed one hand across his face. "We thought you needed help." "No," I said calmly. "Daniel thought I was easier to push aside if people believed I was damaged." He didn't answer immediately. That silence told me everything. Eventually he spoke again, quieter this time. "When you came home, you were different." "Of course I was different." "You stopped talking much. I spent 20 years watching young Americans come home in flag-draped coffins." His eyes lowered. "I didn't know how to reach you anymore. There it was. Not cruelty exactly. Weakness. Some people avoid pain so completely they abandon anyone carrying it openly." We sat there another long minute while gulls drifted overhead. Then my father said something I never expected to hear. "I watched that footage on the news." "What footage?" "The rescue operation. Military archive they showed during the story." I stiffened immediately. I hated that footage. Hated seeing younger versions of dead men moving through smoke and chaos. My father swallowed hard. "You ran back into that fire 3 times. I nodded once. His eyes filled suddenly with emotion he seemed deeply ashamed of. "When you were little," he said hoarsely, "you used to run into storms because you were worried horses got scared during thunder." I blinked in surprise. I barely remembered that. He laughed faintly through tears. "Your mama used to yell at you for it." For a moment, neither of us were old enemies sitting beside a harbor. We were simply a father and daughter who'd spent too many years misunderstanding each other. Then he ruined it. Daniel didn't mean for it to go this far. I stood immediately. "There it is. Evie." "No." "You still don't get it." I turned toward him fully. He used my service against me. He took every sacrifice, every funeral, every nightmare, and turned it into evidence that I couldn't be trusted. My father looked genuinely broken then, and somehow that hurt too. Before leaving, I said the thing I'd carried silently for years. "You know what Grandpa understood that the rest of you never did?" He looked up slowly. "Service changes people," I whispered, "but not always for the worse." That evening, Earl found me sitting outside the outreach center after closing. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired." He lowered himself carefully onto the bench beside me. "War's heavy," he muttered, "but bitterness weighs more." I stared out toward the dark water. "How do you forgive people for something like this?" Earl chuckled softly. "Who said anything about forgiveness yet?" I frowned. He tapped his cane gently against the sidewalk. "First, you decide whether you want to stay angry forever. Rest comes after that." I thought about Grandpa Walter then, about his porch at sunrise, about old dog tags pressed into my hand before boot camp. And for the first time since the lawsuit began, I realized something important. Maybe the inheritance he truly left me wasn't land or money or property. Maybe it was the ability to endure disappointment without letting it poison who I became afterward. The final hearing lasted less than 40 minutes. After everything that happened, after all the paperwork and accusations and whispered rumors, the end arrived quietly. That felt appropriate somehow. By then, Judge Whitmore had reviewed Grandpa Walter's complete estate records, the Veterans Foundation filings, witness testimony, and medical evaluations from independent specialists. The facts were painfully clear. I was not unstable. I was simply a veteran who had survived difficult things. The courtroom looked smaller the second time around, less dramatic. The reporters had mostly disappeared after the earlier headlines faded. Only a few local journalists remained, along with several older veterans sitting quietly in the gallery. Earl sat in the front row wearing the same brown overcoat. So did Chief Ramsey. And Tyler Brooks. I noticed my mother staring at them repeatedly before proceedings began, as though she still couldn't understand why strangers showed me more loyalty than my own family had. Judge Whitmore entered precisely at 9. We all stood. Then the ruling began. His voice remained calm and measured throughout, but every word carried weight. This court finds no evidence whatsoever supporting claims of legal incompetence against Commander Evelyn Carter. Daniel stared rigidly at the table. My father looked exhausted. My mother quietly cried before the judge had even finished speaking. Judge Whitmore continued. The court further recognizes the concerning misuse of military mental health treatment records in an apparent effort to discredit a decorated veteran's character and judgment. Nobody moved. Young men and women who seek counseling after combat service should be commended for responsibility, not punished for honesty. Several veterans in the gallery nodded silently. Then came the final decision. Grandpa Walter's estate, including the Veterans Outreach Foundation, would remain entirely under my authority, exactly as intended. No restrictions, no supervision, no shared control. The judge closed the file carefully. Court adjourned. That was it. No dramatic music. No applause. Just the sound of chairs moving and people quietly gathering coats beneath fluorescent courthouse lights. Afterward, several veterans approached to shake my hand. One elderly Marine grasped my shoulder firmly and said, "Welcome home, Commander." I nearly cried hearing that, because for years I'd felt like I belonged everywhere except home. Daniel tried speaking to me outside the courtroom. "Evie, wait." I stopped but didn't turn immediately. When I finally faced him, he looked nothing like the confident younger brother I'd grown up resenting. He looked nervous, hollowed out. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. The words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. "For what part?" I asked. His eyes lowered. "All of it." Rain fell softly outside courthouse windows while people passed us in both directions. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel finally admitted the truth. "I spent my whole life feeling second place next to you." I frowned. "That's ridiculous." "No, it isn't." His voice cracked slightly. "You were brave, disciplined. Grandpa respected you. People admired you. You were Mom and Dad's favorite. That's not the same thing." I stared at him carefully then, and for the first time in my life I saw something I'd never allowed myself to see before. Daniel had been insecure for years. Not evil, not heartless. Weak. There's a difference. Weak people sometimes do terrible things because they're terrified of feeling small. That realization didn't erase the damage, but it softened something sharp inside me. "I can't pretend this didn't happen," I told him quietly. "I know, but Grandpa wanted that foundation helping veterans, not feeding family wars." Daniel nodded slowly. "So what happens now?" I looked out the courthouse window toward the wet Norfolk streets beyond. Then I surprised both of us. "You can help." His head lifted slightly. "What?" "The foundation." I shrugged faintly. "Administrative work, fundraising maybe, supervised, earn trust back slowly." He stared at me like he couldn't believe what he'd heard. "Why would you do that after everything?" I thought about Earl's words. Bitterness weighs more. Then I answered honestly, because somebody in this family should finally stop keeping score. Outside the courthouse, my mother approached carefully. She looked smaller than I remembered, older too. Age has a way of stripping pride down to whatever truth remains underneath. I was wrong, she whispered tearfully. I nodded once. Part of me had waited decades to hear those words. Strangely, they didn't feel as satisfying as I once imagined. My father came last. Typical. He stood silently in front of me for several seconds before speaking. I thought strength meant never breaking, he said roughly. His eyes were red. Turns out, it meant carrying things the rest of us couldn't. That nearly undid me. Not because it fixed everything, but because it was finally honest. A few months later, the Walter Carter Veterans Outreach Center officially opened near the Norfolk waterfront. Nothing fancy. Just a brick building with counseling offices housing assistance programs, support groups, and a small coffee room where older veterans liked sitting for hours arguing about politics and football. Exactly the kind of place Grandpa would have wanted. At the dedication ceremony, families filled folding chairs beneath warm spring sunlight. Vietnam veterans stood beside young Marines barely home from overseas. Gold Star mothers hugged one another quietly near the entrance. Earl sat in the front row, grinning proudly like he personally built the building himself. Before the ribbon cutting, somebody asked if I wanted to make a speech. I almost refused. Then I thought about Luis, about Grandpa Walter, about all the people who carried invisible things home from service. So I stepped to the microphone. The strongest people I ever met, I said quietly, weren't the ones who avoided pain. They were the ones who carried pain, and still chose kindness afterward. The crowd remained completely silent. I reached into my pocket then and held up Grandpa Walter's old dog tags. These belonged to my grandfather, I continued. He taught me that service isn't about applause. It's about showing up for people when it matters. I placed the tags gently inside a memorial case near the lobby wall. For a second, I could almost see him standing there again beneath gray Georgia skies, saluting a frightened 17-year-old girl boarding a bus toward an uncertain future. That girl had spent years trying to prove herself worthy. But standing there that afternoon beside veterans, families, and even the relatives who once betrayed me, I finally understood something simple. Worthiness was never the question. Love was. Later that evening, after everybody left, Earl and I stood near the Chesapeake Bay, watching sunset turn the water gold. You finally feel at peace, he asked. I smiled softly. No, I admitted. Then I looked out toward the harbor where distant Navy ships rested beneath fading light. But I finally feel home. And if this story touched your heart in some way, maybe share it with somebody who carried burdens quietly for others. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones nobody fully thanks until much later. And sometimes healing begins simply by being seen.